Hey, David Julin here, pastor here at First Baptist Cramerton, bringing you this week's sermon. Now, our sermon text comes from the Gospel of Mark in the 7th chapter, beginning in verse 31. Now, we pick up Jesus here, and he is moving east with the disciples, moving east from the Sea of Galilee, Judea. That's where he spent most of his time. But now he's going across the river east to the land called the Decapolis, which basically means 10 cities. It is a region that is predominantly, we believe, Gentile. So Jews there, but predominantly Gentile. So we pick up in verse 31. Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon, down to the Sea of Galilee and into the region of the Decapolis. There, some people brought to him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk, and they begged Jesus to place his hand on him. After he took him aside, away from the crowd, Jesus put his fingers into the man's ears. Then he spit and touched the man's tongue. He looked up to the heaven with a deep sigh and said to him, Ephphatha, Ephphatha, which means be open. At this, the man's ears were opened, his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly. Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone, but the more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. People were overwhelmed with amazement. He has done everything well, they said. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. Now, we don't know why Jesus moved from the west side of the Jordan and bound Galilee over to the east side. Could be he's seeking privacy. He is being followed by crowds, we know, and he decides to get away and be on his own to seek some privacy. It may be it's an intentional part of his ministry, that he wants to go into a place where there are more people who have not experienced his teaching and his miracles. We don't really know, but I think that some people, the understanding for some people at that time would be in the pagan understanding that there are regions where different gods or demons or spirits are able to be in control. And so one of the things Jesus is doing, going by these places, is showing that his power transcends borders, it transcends beliefs, and Jesus is showing that he is able, through his teaching and through his ministry and healing, to show that he is the Lord. So, but even the Gentiles, the pagans, if that's likely who it is, and I believe that's who it is, they recognize the power. They've heard of Jesus. He is becoming more and more well known because of the miracles he performs. And people are recognizing him. And he is going and he's willing to heal not just Jews, but Gentiles. You know, I was struck as I read this in Mark about how many times people bring to Jesus their friends for healing and help. We see it here. People bring the mute and the deaf man to Jesus. Just a couple of chapters back in Mark chapter 2. Remember the famous story, which has always been one of my favorites, of the friends who bring Jesus. A man is paralyzed and he's unable to walk, and they get him there to bring Jesus, but the crowds are so great inside the house, they can't bring him inside. And I don't know that this happened, but I wonder sometimes people get discouraged when they're having to try to get help. Maybe they've been discouraged over and over and over. And I can just picture maybe him saying, the man on the mat who's paralyzed to the friends, oh, it's no use, just take me back. But they're like, no, we're going to find a way. And remember the story. They climb up, open a hole in the roof, and lower him down to Jesus. So that's in Mark chapter 2. In Mark chapter 5, we have Jairus, who's the synagogue leader, who he goes to appeal to Jesus. We find the man who is in Mark chapter 8, there in Bethesda, more friends bring a blind man to Jesus. That we find in Mark chapter 9, the boy, his father comes to Jesus. The disciples can't heal him, But the boy's father persists and perseveres and asks for Jesus to heal him. So we see how people help bring others to healing and salvation and hope. Let me ask you a question here this week. Where can we be the friends and family, the link to bring people to Jesus? You know what I mean? No matter how strong a chain is, if it misses a couple of links, it doesn't do its job. Where can we be the link to do that? Where can we guide people for spiritual help, physical healing? You know, there's some simple things. Taking people to appointments, maybe for the doctor or for counseling, all kinds of things. You would be surprised how many people have to struggle and pay extra, try to find some place, and it discourages them from even getting the same kind of care. Maybe we can encourage people to go into counseling, to even go into medical school or something like that. You know, this is something that Christians need to aspire to so that they can be used as instruments of healing by God. Do we support people when they're discouraged? I have often found, and I've mentioned this before to my congregation, sometimes people will tell me, you know, when my husband had a heart attack, when something happened, people rallied at the church around me. But then perhaps somebody went through a divorce, or somebody is arrested, or they have someone who has an addiction. And then, you know, the casseroles stop. And they often feel isolated and alone. One writer, a recent article, Mary Lemmy, who is at King's College London, talks about some of the secret ingredients for a successful recovery for addiction. We often think it's simply a person developing their individual skills and working on triggers and their will, power, and everything. But she talks about the importance of those people, and she had an acronym, CHIMES, and I'm not going to do everything in it, but so much of it involved the person connecting with others. The C, what Carl Jung called the protective wall of human community, installing hope and optimism and empowering. All these things come from a community, and she studies this, and not everybody is brought to recovery in the same way, but they found this pattern in a great many people. This is where the church can step in and empower and encourage. Remember last week's sermon in Titus, when Titus called out all of the believers there, Paul called them out to be eager to do good. As a church, whether you're talking about here from First Baptist Cramerton or wherever you live, how can we help those who are in our circle, the people that we know? How can we expand that circle? Perhaps you're praying for help today. Let me ask you, are you praying for help? Are you looking for help? Are you open to someone new? Are you open to some new process? Remember, the Good Samaritan was not the one that the person who asked Jesus, or even in the parable, would seem to be the likely person, but he was the one that helped. Sometimes I also understand, and I bet you do too, about wounds that go deeper. John Claypool tells the story of one of his friends who was a long-time primary elementary teacher in Kentucky, in rural Kentucky. And she said one day a little boy came in with all the others on the first day of school in first grade, and he just seemed so out of place. He acted almost like a frightened creature rather than a little boy. And she began to speak with him, began to work with him, and eventually when they took him to somebody outside the school, they found out he was actually deaf. He was deaf and unable to speak. And as they explored it a little further, the little boy had lived in a home where the father was an abusive alcoholic, and he had cuffed him up about his head and his ears so much that his ears, the eardrums, had been shattered somehow, and he was unable to hear and unable to speak because of that. There was a lot of help that they could get for them. He was eventually taken away from the family. But, he said that she said that the wounds of the abuse and the trauma were much harder to heal than the physical healing. You see, the heart and the soul cannot always be healed as easily as even a bone that is broken. So we have to be in the church ready to be open to offering compassion and kindness and empathy and perseverance. I also noted here Jesus' personal involvement and care in the healing of the mute man. He healed some people, he didn't even see them. But here Jesus goes, and notice what he did? He grabbed him and took him off by the side. I think that's a sign. Sometimes when people can't hear, it's hard to speak to them, and we know this when people are in crowds. So Jesus takes him off privately, a sign that he was sensitive to that. And he puts his fingers in the man's ears, and then takes his finger and puts his spit on it and puts it in the man's tongue, or on the man's tongue. This is an intimate, personal involvement that involves his healing this poor man, who we know must have suffered greatly in that time. I believe this, that most ministry that Christians are involved with involves getting involved with people. I'm sorry, that's just how it is. Jesus is involved with people. Augustine, the great church father, said, Jesus loved each as if there were none other, and loved all as he loved one. We are called to be like Christ, and he knew people's names. He took the time to be with them. It reminds me of the story, I'm not sure if it's true or not, but of the little boy who was being taught to say the Lord's Prayer, and he said, Our Father who art in heaven, how do you know my name? Jesus is clear that he cares and has compassion. He identifies and is connected with the people he encounters. He even has sympathy, empathy for the suffering man. In some way, some sense, he senses how he has suffered. Maybe he's been made fun of. Maybe he was abused somehow and was unable to hear. And it says that Jesus gives a deep sigh, or deep groaning. He groans when he encounters the young man. I don't know if he had a sense of the pain that he had, or just the entire pain, I guess, of human suffering. But this Christian understanding of being like Christ, he says in Colossians that we are to be renewed in the knowledge of the image of its Creator. We are being renewed, so we are being renewed to be like Christ. You see, the Christian faith, it's one of those things that the more we grow in the faith, we don't ignore, or we don't become desensitized to the pain and the problems of this world, as we grow as a Christian. Sometimes people, if they just want to be, quote, happy, they can become desensitized to the world. At the same time, we also realize that it is God's grace. We don't save anyone, really. We may be instruments, even if we are surgeons. We may be instruments of God's healing, but the healing and the saving, for the most part, is left to the processes that God has brought in to the world, at least for most of us. But we can't ignore the healing and the hurt. Jesus says, Ephphatha, which is Aramaic. That was his original language. Mark was really close to the time of Jesus, likely the earliest gospel, maybe 10, 15, 20 years later. And with that word, he looks up to heaven, has that universal sense of looking to God, and says, Ephphatha, and the ears and the tongue are opened. I hope this week that you will be open to how you can be a person like the people who brought the mute man to Jesus? I don't know how that would be. There's maybe some things that you could do. Maybe you could have a voice of encouragement. Maybe you could have a cup of coffee with somebody. Maybe you could learn of a better way to treat somebody. I don't know how that would be. Maybe you could take somebody to the doctor. But those are ways that we can be witnesses to and for Christ. To be open to how God can call us and can call us to speak. Are we open to God working in our lives? Are you open to that? And then working in the lives of others? But let me ask you this question before we close. Are we open to those who are trying to help us? Sometimes it's easier to help others than it is to allow help to be given to us. Are we open to those who God is sending our way to try to help us? Are we just going to say, I'm going to do it the same way it's always been done? Listen, God, through Jesus Christ, provides healing and hope. I don't know why everybody's not healed, but I do know that Christ is the healer, physically, spiritually, and He provides people also that can be instruments of His healing. Sometimes it's through prayer. Sometimes it might be through medicine. Sometimes it might be through simply being that link to help somebody, to encourage them to seek out the help that they need. Lord, help us to be able to be the link to others and to be open to allow You to help us in our lives. I hope you have a wonderful week this week. Let's think about how God can use us and help us to be the link to help others and be open to how we can be helped. Listen, God bless you, and I sure hope to see you soon.